if we had the political will, we could certainly find the money for something like this. We found $35 billion for buying a pipeline. We found, roughly $50 billion to give to car companies for their operating costs. Like, why is public transit left to fend for itself, right? When we're just asking for a drop in the bucket here.
Welcome to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy. I'm Clement Nokos, editor of Perspectives Journal and research director at the Broadbent Institute. In a joint statement by Environmental Defence, a number of mayors and municipal representatives from cities across Canada, public transit activist groups, and transit agencies like the STM in Montreal, that was released on October 28th at the Transit for Tomorrow Summit in Ottawa, the coalition stated, "Transit is the most powerful method of tackling traffic congestion. It is the lifeblood of economic growth in our biggest cities. It is a solution to the rising cost of living. It helps us reduce carbon emissions. But public transit systems across the country are in a financial crisis." Have you ever tried riding a train or bus lately? In Canada, if you are so lucky to have a train or bus or any public transit near where you are getting to get where you're going, service has not been great, and many have noticed that it's getting worse. While the news media focuses on traffic jams involving cars and trucks on highways, less attention is paid to the fact that transit ridership across the country has not recovered to pre-pandemic levels in most cities. This can't all be attributed to more people working from home when we're all still stuck in traffic. Investment in public transit has weakened. Ridership has stalled as commuters are forced to drive, and the economy loses billions in lost productivity because of how much we all lose in time. So I ask an expert, dude, where's my bus? Nate Wallace, Program Manager for Clean Transportation at Environmental Defence Canada and organizer of the Transit for Tomorrow Summit, joins me now to help answer this question. Nate, thank you for joining us on the Perspectives Journal podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so here's a bit of a story. With your organization's Transit for Tomorrow Summit held in Ottawa last October, I chose to take public transit to get from Toronto, from my home in Mississauga to Toronto, to get to Ottawa to attend on just a Sunday afternoon. Gave myself a lot of time to do that. But in the morning, what I had to do was walk over to a GO bus that was a kilometer away, to take that very early in the morning to get from Western Mississauga to Union Station in Toronto. And then once at Union Station in Toronto, I made it on time, took the Via Rail train, customarily from Union Station to Ottawa Tremblay Station. Can I say that being on that train, it was, of course, late. I don't think there's been a time, a trip back and forth, where at least one of the trains I was taking on Via Rail has ever been completely on time. But deciding to do that in keeping with the spirit of the summit, I also got into Tremblay. And then in trying to take the Ottawa LRT, there's no notification prior or anything, but I walk up to the gate where the station is and found it to be closed for the whole weekend. There were signs that said take the R1 bus that's located out front. So I was a bit underdressed for the cold there, and so waiting for the bus out, walking around that circle to wait at the bus stop with a number of other people who also planned on taking the LRT. I had to wait for a packed bus that came through and rode that into Centertown, and then from there walked over to my hotel. That's just, I thought, hey, welcome back to Ottawa. It's a
welcome to Ottawa, yeah.
And then I have to say that, still in keeping with the spirit of the summit, I chose again to take the LRT back to Tremblay Station. But trying to get on from Parliament Station, I get on, and without any warning or whatever, the LRT that day stopped at Herdman Station, just one stop away from Tremblay. And the conductor said, "Everybody out, this train is turning back." Myself and a whole train of, students, elderly people, racialized people just trying to get to work, groaned, got off the train. We all headed down the stairs from Herdman Station and waited for that R1 bus. And we waited for that R1 bus, and we waited. Luckily, I knew something like this might happen, so I gave myself time. But while waiting for that bus, other trains came in, unloaded passengers. So it was a whole mess of people just waiting for a bus. And then it turned out to be one of the smaller buses, not the longer articulated buses, not the double-decker buses, but as an R1 bus, with everyone spilling over from the sidewalk over the curb at Herdman Station to get to where they were supposed to go. If they had, maybe they had known that there was this interruption, they'd make other plans. But from there, was able to fit myself in as the last passenger because I knew I was the next stop, to get onto the bus by the door, packed to the brim. The bus didn't take everybody that was waiting there on the curb to get to Tremblay Station. And then from there, waited for my train. That train was also late getting into Union Station as I had originally planned. So instead of taking the last GO train home that night into Mississauga, I had to wait another additional hour for a packed 21 Milton bus. So Nate, how did public transit get to be so bad in Canada?
There's a short answer and a long answer. I'll start with the short answer, and that's a single word, which is neglect. And I'll get into it, but I think that there's also three big things that I think we'll get into throughout today's interview. So on top of neglect, I think privatization of infrastructure and project delivery, I think that's a big thing, both in terms of the mess that is the Ottawa LRT, but also the fact that your VIA train was late. It's never been have a worse on-time performance than right now. I think it's like about 55% of the trains are on time, which is like the worst ever recorded in the most recent report from Via Rail. And that's because they don't actually own the track that they operate on. But that's a whole other story, which is tied to privatization as well. But also three, I think, is essentially a regime of permanent austerity for transit operating budgets. And that's basically ties to the real broken funding model for public transit we have in our country. But I'll start with neglect, and because I think it really kind of encompasses everything else. I would say that it really stems from how our political leaders see public transit. Other countries, typically outside of North America, like in Europe and East Asia, they have really excellent public transit because they see it as like a universal public utility that's as basic to people as like water, sewage, or electricity or power infrastructure. In North America, we kind of see it as like an optional nice to have, whose like basic function is to operate like essentially like a welfare program for poor folks who don't have any other option. The default assumption is that transit, according to our policymakers, is that it doesn't need to be good because the people who vote, the people who matter politically, can just use their cars if it doesn't work. And we end up treating public transit like we treat all other welfare programs, which is just to let it crumble. And it's okay if the bus doesn't come on time or it doesn't run past 10 p.m. or is late all the time, because unfortunately, poor people in general don't matter to our political class. What this results is sort of like a self-reinforcing system where, we're just tiny transit systems that with very little service in towns all across the country, you could apply to Via Rail as well, that serve very, very few people. And in a democracy, when you don't have a very large political constituency fighting for itself, it's going to get sidelined. So I like to think of a small town like Fredericton, where I grew up in New Brunswick, where it's sort of stuck at the bottom of the downward spiral with low ridership and really little political will to make things better. And, I compare it to, if you look at country like Germany compared to Canada, on average, the average Canadian takes one trip on Via Rail every 10 years on average. In Germany, the average is 25 intercity rail trips per year per person, right? So that divide, I think, is core to, Germans will vote for politicians who promise them better rail because they use it. And it's sort of a self-reinforcing cycle. If we want things to change, we really need to organize for better transit and fight for it politically, because then you can sort of have the loop go in the other direction.
Like, I see what you're saying. Transit riders are treated as something like second-class citizens. But I mean, even what you're referring to there with Germany, I do see a lot of memes from some of my German friends about Deutsche Bahn being like not on time, and they have their complaints
to
about
European standards. Yeah. So when it connects to like Switzerland and other places who are even way better, it's embarrassing.
For them, that's embarrassing. But for us, this is the dream. This is just like a very regular standard thing for folks in other places in the world. What's stopping us from even achieving just these normal levels of transit ambition? Why can't we build public transit across Canada? Like, we're trying, no doubt about it. You see in Vancouver, the Broadway project, there's the kerfuffle in Edmonton. You have the never-ending saga of the Eglinton Crosstown. And like I just said, my experiences with the Ottawa LRT, these things they're trying. We're getting that supposedly done, in a lot of ways not done, since some of these things are way past due. But what's stopping us from achieving normal levels of transit ambition in Canada?
I would say Canada is quite unique globally in how weak our cities are within our constitutional structure. Cities are essentially people call it creatures of the province, right? They have very limited powers, revenue tools. They kind of can't really do anything like building major projects like transit unless the province gets heavily involved. And we kind of have had a history of really wild swings in political support for transit at the federal and provincial level, but particularly the provincial level, depending on political cycles. And what that has caused is sort of like building any kind of public infrastructure, especially really complex projects like transit. It's like a muscle, right? And if you don't exercise it, it gets weaker and weaker over time. It requires a lot of expertise. And when you're not building transit and building up that public sector sort of state capacity, those people leave the payroll, that expertise starts to get concentrated in the private sector, and you get a hollowing out. And that's kind of what has happened in Canada. We've had building booms in like the 60s and 70s and subway projects in different cities, and it kind of really depends on the political cycle. And then the cities don't have the powers to keep the momentum going. And then we just have an atrophying. And that's sort of what happened, particularly in the 90s and 2000s, where we just sort of like forgot how to build transit projects at the public sector level. And now, especially since 2016, when the federal government has now come in and said, okay, we're going to do some transit funding, and provinces get on board. And that's sort of caused a new boom in projects being constructed across the country. But cities have like no expertise and they have no idea what they're doing because they haven't done it in decades. So they turn to public-private partnerships. So like the private sector consultants who are really focused more on profit than the public interest. There's tons of like really well-documented problems with this model. So you basically have transit projects that are built to deliver contractual agreements to the letter. And so you have products that are built to minimize legal liability rather than minimize things from breaking down, and where corners are cut wherever possible to pad profit margins. And the contracts are written by civil servants who quite often don't know what they're doing, don't know what they want. Like City of Ottawa asked for a train with like specs that never existed anywhere in the world. And that's... And then we rely on consultants who manage other consultants rather than have in-house civil service capacity to do this stuff. There's been actually some really interesting literature about this come out recently, looking at surveys of global projects. So one report called Transit Cost Project came out of the States, which really looked into this. And they found that like the rise of the consultocracy around transit projects has really enabled the politicization of decisions. And it ends up meaning like there's huge price increases to these construction projects. It's why we have in Ontario, the Ontario line in Toronto is costing about $1 billion per kilometer to build, while you can build transit projects in countries like France and South Korea for half the price. And when you don't have internal capacity to actually build it yourself, you kind of just have to accept whatever price is given to you by the big P3 consortiums, because they're the only ones who know how to build anything in this country, which is, I think, really, really big problem. And that's I think, at the core of what has gone wrong with a lot of major projects being built across the country. Like in other countries that like France, Spain, Italy, they all use public sector construction companies, or they use public sector agencies to act as their own consultant to other cities. But our equivalents, like in Ontario, Metrolinx and Infrastructure Ontario, sort of are wedded to this P3 philosophy and sort of bake it into every project that they're involved in. And we've seen the results.
In your report, actually, you released a report with Equiterre a few months ago, earlier this year, called Putting the Wheels on the Bus, Unlocking the Potential of Public Transit to Cut Carbon Emissions in Canada. And you highlight thousands of idle buses. Like, these are the kinds of buses I could have probably taken, given the Ottawa LRT shutdown, but they just weren't all available. So I had to wait with so many others just for the next one and the next one and the next one. Meanwhile, you say in this report there are thousands missing. Never mind the actual like infrastructure that doesn't yet exist, but the thousands of buses and probably other pieces of infrastructure that do exist. We're missing people driving these buses, driving these trains. What do we need to get them going again?
Well, first, we need to explain to folks why there are 1,700 idle buses across the country that could be in service. It kind of has to do with the broken funding model. I kind of outlined earlier that cities in Canada don't have revenue tools like other cities in different countries do. Like, they don't have access to sales income or payroll taxes. What they do have is property taxes and fares to fund transit. And property taxes don't actually grow every year with the economy. So you kind of have to have a fight every single year, a political fight, which we usually lose when it comes to property taxes, which kind of entrenches this regime of permanent austerity at the local level for transit operating budgets, where like cities can't run a deficit on the operating side. They can for the capital side, but not the operating side. And just to explain the difference between capital and operations. Capital is your construction budget. It lets you buy assets like a bus. It lets you build like LRT projects, but the operating side is actually paying salaries of bus drivers to actually get that infrastructure moving. And so at the local level, we have this regime of permanent austerity. At the provincial level, funding for transit operations is most cases non-existent or so small it represents a really small drop in the bucket. And at the federal level, which is one of the big things that we've criticized in this report, is they're kind of contributing to this problem where all the money that we've invested since the federal government has gotten involved in transit in 2016, about over $30 billion, is all capital. So cities can use the money to buy a new bus, but they can't use the money to hire a driver. But because we have this sort of really entrenched regime of austerity at the local level for operating budgets, it's meant that we've relied so heavily on fares to fund our transit systems. And when the pandemic happened, that essentially broke that whole funding model with ridership declines. So transit agencies across the country have had these massive increases in spare buses that we've bought with federal money, with provincial money to expand service, but we're not actually expanding service with it because we've had to cut service because of this broken funding model on the operations side. So nobody's funding operations. So we have this sort of really big growth in service capacity that we're not actually using, which is really frustrating from a climate policy perspective, because what all the literature says is that the surest way to grow ridership and actually get people out of their cars and reduce carbon emissions and all the other benefits that come with that is actually just to run convenient, reliable service. And when you're not doing that because you literally just have buses that you're not using because you're not getting the funding, and then the federal government is announcing the next generation program, still the exact same thing, still ignoring this problem. We're spending all this money that's not being really useful, where you have cities like Toronto and just this morning Mississauga having to ask for big sums of money for operations for transit lines that they're opening, like new rail lines that they can't actually afford to run because they don't have the operating funding for it, which sort of leads to all these knock-on effects of like, that's essentially why your bus is late, doesn't come on time, and why people are having worse service now. Like, we looked at the numbers. We have fewer buses in service now, like $30 billion later, than we did a decade ago. We have, if you adjust for population growth, we have 7% worse transit service on average in cities across the country than we did in 2016 when the federal investment program started. At the end of the day, what the federal government's policy approach is, it's not working. And what we use the report to do is really highlight these problems and say, hey, look, we can fix this. We have a next generation transit investment program that's taking the place of the old one that started in 2016. We have the chance to actually change things and fix this. We just need to have a bigger role for the federal government, with provinces too, on a cost share basis on the operating funding side. But we've continued to essentially get crickets.
Because it's very funny then that you say you hear crickets from the federal government because from attending the Transit for Tomorrow Summit, it's clear that policymakers and thinkers from all levels of government, virtually all political stripes, are on board the train when it comes to more transit. You also have labor unions, in particular, buildings and trades unions that create all this infrastructure, transit operators like ATU, unions in the manufacturing sector that build these vehicles. They're all in this together with the riders. I mean, it sounds like we have this big movement, this coalition, but politically, what's stopping us from getting to the goal of, say, doubling transit ridership by 2035?
Yeah, and I'll add some context to that. So the report we put out that highlighted all these problems with the federal program, we kind of sketched out an alternative of what if we wanted to be really ambitious and unlock the power of public transit to cut carbon emissions, right? We have all these targets in other sectors like electric vehicles. We want to get to 100% EV sales by 2035. For electricity, we want to get to net zero emissions electric grid by 2035. A lot of these targets are sort of really tied up in us being able to actually meet our emissions reduction goal. But we don't actually have any goals or targets when it comes to public transit. We're just spending money and we don't really care about the results we're getting. That's essentially the policy approach of the federal government right now. So what we said is, okay, what would it take to double public transit ridership by 2035? And we got a really reputable modeling firm, Dunsky Energy Climate Advisors, to model this out for us. And we modeled 4 policies essentially, which is the big investment in operations funding, which would mean that they would have to essentially double the size of the program, adding an additional $3 billion per year. Have incentive for cities to put in bus lanes to speed up transit service, enabling more homes near transit. That's something that they've said that they want with this program is having like minimum density requirements near transit. But if you look at the fine print, that's not actually a hard requirement, and that's a nerdy discussion we could get into another day. But also having requirements to shift to electric buses. We found that all those things together, including the operating funding, could cut carbon emissions by 65 million tons by 2035 cumulatively, which is massive, right? Like the equivalent is about the emissions from 20 million cars over 1 year. So just to put that in perspective. And the big barrier is political resistance. We had a big lobby day following our summit with a lot of our allied folks who came, like our transit rider groups and different environmental organizations. And we had a lot of conversations with federal policymakers across every political party. I probably can't say the details, Chatham House rules of specific conversations, but what we heard was from the government was, look, we kind of concede this argument that operations funding is actually, you're right about operations funding. This is actually a problem, but we don't really see our responsibility being to fix this problem, and we don't have the money for it, was essentially a big answer that we got. Was, hey, look, if we spent money on this, we'd have to raise taxes, or if the deficit was bigger, then interest rates wouldn't come down as fast from the central bank and stuff like that. And the case I made was, look, we can find the money. The cost that we've costed out with this modeling was about $3 billion in additional funding per year, which is about half a percentage point of the total federal budget. It's like a 1% increase in corporate income tax would fully pay for it. If we had the political will, we could certainly find the money for something like this. We found $35 billion for buying a pipeline. We found, roughly $50 billion to give to car companies for their operating costs. Like, why is public transit left to fend for itself, right? When we're just asking for a drop in the bucket here.
Just a drop in the bucket. I mean, is there hope? Should I kind of give up taking the bus, riding my bike if all these bike lanes are also going to get removed? Should I just give up and buy an electric car? Or what's the prospects for public transit, the future of public transit in Canada?
Honestly, like what I'm worried about is that, sure, sustainable transportation is under attack, right? We have this fight about bike lanes, which I think is really a pretext for, a culture war leading up to an early provincial election, because there's no evidence behind it. It's total nonsense what the provincial government is doing. And we have all this cuts to transit because, politicians care more about, the flashy cutting ribbons than actually dealing with the day-to-day service levels that people who actually use transit are dealing with. But not everyone can afford to buy an electric car. That's a problem. You and I maybe could one day. I can't right now, but maybe you could, but so maybe other people could.
No, I can't either. Don't worry. I'm right there with you.
Well, that's the thing. Like, public transit is a socially inclusive climate solution that has a really low barrier to entry, right? And in most cases, in a lot of cases, it's actually people's only option. And just saying, like, give up and you can own a car, that's sort of the default of the neglect policy approach, which I sort of outlined at the beginning, where, like, that's the default assumption is transit doesn't need to be good. We can just let it fail because people will buy a car, or if they care about the environment, they'll buy an electric car. But the reality is not everybody can afford to do that.
There were also a lot of transit advocacy groups at the Transit for Tomorrow Summit. Maybe there's hope to be found in what they've been pushing.
Yeah, honestly, I think that there's a lot of hope at getting wins at the local level. I know Vancouver recently City Council passed a motion around bus lanes. In Toronto, I think there's a lot of conversation around what are ways that we can get bus lanes in and sort of use the upcoming FIFA World Cup as an opportunity to drive that conversation because it's going to need to happen temporarily regardless, because the city's just going to be completely jammed with people in town for FIFA. We're going to need to make transit improvements regardless for the basic fact of getting people around the city. What if we could make that permanent? There's a lot of local wins that we can make, but let's not give up hope. I think there is a growing movement of people who are saying, like, public transit doesn't have to suck. We can have in Canada, one of the richest countries on the planet, some of the basic infrastructure that other people in other countries take for granted. We don't have to settle for less, and we can fight for better. And I think it's always worth fighting for better.
Nate, where can people find more of your work?
I'm on Twitter as my handle is @ClimateNate. Also recently on Blue Sky with the same handle. You can find the report I was talking about earlier by Googling environmental defense and the name of the report, Putting Wheels on the Bus. Should be the first thing that comes up.
We'll also put that in the show notes. Nate Wallace, thank you for chatting with me on the Perspectives Journal podcast.
Thanks a lot for having me.
That was Nate Wallace, Program Manager for Clean Transportation at Environmental Defense Canada. His latest report, released earlier this year, Putting Wheels on the Bus, Unlocking the Potential of Public Transit to Cut Carbon Emissions in Canada, is now available at environmentaldefense.ca. And if you like this interview, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy, on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca.